Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Wellesley. I hope everybody is enjoying reunion weekend, having the chance to reconnect with old friends, make new ones, and of course, enjoy the glorious campus on this fabulous weekend. I also want to extend a very special welcome to alumni and friends who are live streaming this conversation, not only from other spots around campus, but all over the globe. So to those of you who aren't here, greetings from Wellesley College. My name is Martha Goldberg Aronson, and I hail from the Green class of 1989. I am honored to be serving as the president of the Wellesley College Alumni Association. And today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming back to Wellesley two very special and distinguished alums, Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. These women, of course, need no introduction. But what I can tell you, since I have been on reunion cycle with them for the past 30 years, is that they have remained incredibly dedicated and close to Wellesley, close to our students, close to their classmates, all throughout the years, regardless of which positions they've been in, and always serving our country in such distinguished capacities. I know that for both of them, Wellesley holds a very special place in their hearts. While many of us in the classes ending in 4 and 9 have been at reunions over the years with Secretaries Clinton and Albright, I also know that many of you have not yet had the opportunity to get to know our fantastic president, Paula Johnson. President Johnson is completing her 3rd year at Wellesley and her first reunion with the 4s and 9s. So it is really an honor today that Dr. Paula Johnson will be moderating our conversation. So, with gratitude and admiration, I now invite Secretaries Clinton and Albright, along with President Johnson, to the stage. Welcome home.
Wow. It is so wonderful to be here with both of you. And thank you for being here with us. You know, this is a very special moment in time. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time for this conversation. And as we proceed, I'm going to drop, we are among friends, so I'm going to drop the secretary. Is that okay? We're just going to go, we are just going to go with Madeleine and Hillary. So I'm just going to jump right in. You know, you're here celebrating your reunions, 50 years, 60 years, class of 59, class of 69. 10 years apart, and the world was different for each of you. Can you just talk to us? What was it like for you to graduate at that moment in time, 59 and 69? Madeleine, maybe you can start.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Paula.
Thank you.
And to be at Wellesley, where I think we do feel incredibly welcome. So, and we are actually really, really good friends. So
Yep.
This is a lot of fun. I think that 59 was a very different kind of year in terms of being in some ways transitional as far as women's roles were concerned. I think that those of us, and it's hard to speak for such a diverse group of people, but we were more kind of took for granted things that were going to happen, that we would have kind of normal lives. By the way, we all remember our commencement speaker a little bit differently. It was the Secretary of Defense, Neil McElroy, because his daughter was in our class. And it was kind of like your main responsibility is to get married and have interesting children, and some of us think we heard boys. So it was, and the fact that we didn't walk out is a sign of that we kind of took it the way it was. This was basically quite a conservative school. There was a very small group of Democrats. I was one of them. We went into town to raise money for the Democrats, dollars for Democrats, and I started my fundraising life by the following remark. I was in Boston, and this crusty old man came up and said, $5 for you, baby, but not $1 for the Democrats.
Wow.
So,
that could get him into trouble
right,
now.
right. But I think that most of us were looking forward to what was kind of a life that had been expected. Yeah. We were told to get married. I waited a really long time to get married, 3 days after graduation. But also, there were more split-ups. There was one of our classmates, Emily Cohen, did a study of the classes in 9 that ended in 9s. And the 49 class had the most traditional marriages. I think our class, there were some split-ups and things. And your class, I think the men already knew what they were getting into. But anyway, I think we were more kind of accepting of things, and it was only once we got out that we recognized that it was a somewhat different world that offered a variety of opportunities for us.
Yeah, wonderful. Hillary.
Well, I agree completely with Madeleine's description of the late 50s in the country as well as here at Wellesley. And things began to change at an accelerating pace with the election of John Kennedy, which just seemed like a sea change in our society as well as our politics. So when I and the class of '69 arrived in the fall of '65, we were already, I think, different. We weren't sure exactly what that meant or how each of us individually would define it, but there was a lot of turmoil in the 4 years we were there. The Vietnam War began to heat up. We all knew boys. Some of us dated boys who were trying to figure out what they were going to do. Some served, some, tried all different ways to avoid it. There was a lot of discussion about that. There were events here on campus. There were soldiers who'd gone AWOL who wanted to take refuge in the chapel. There were demonstrations that we went into Boston or Cambridge to join. There was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and then shortly after classes ended, Senator Robert Kennedy. So our time here was marked by an enormous amount of change and turmoil that we just couldn't help but feel like there was a real shaking of the foundations in our country. And again, that didn't mean we knew exactly what we were going to do, but I think Madeleine is right that there was a big interest in trying to figure out what would be either expected paths or new paths that we could follow. I remember going in to take the law students exam, the LSAT, with a couple of people from Wellesley and then some people, some women we knew from Radcliffe, and we were literally the only women in this huge hall at Harvard, and we were sitting there waiting for the exam to begin, and all of a sudden all these young men started to harass us by saying, what are you doing here? Why are you taking this exam? If you get in, I'll have to go to Vietnam. You could be the cause of my death. I mean, it was so, you can't, the level of intensity in much of our daily life and certainly in our country's life was so different from what had gone on before. and we're all just sitting there with our, our heads down, trying to avoid being rattled or, feeling terrible before we start this big exam that's going to be one way we decide what to do with our lives. So we came at a moment of great turmoil, and I think that it was both on social as well as political terms, because I remember we were protesting against parietals. And, yeah, yes, right, yeah. And there were a bunch of us who were organized. There's a picture that circulated where, we're all there. Somebody's speaking, I'm there, other of my classmates are there, and we're basically striking a blow for women's empowerment by saying, we don't want to have to come in so early, we don't want to leave our doors open when we have boys in the dorm, although that looks like a better idea when I became a mother than when I was a student. So we, and we wanted to change parts of the curriculum so that we'd have more freedom of choice in what we studied. So it was both external to the college and internal. We had the beginning of Ethos, and I know my friend and classmates who started it. I think Karen Williamson was honored just a little while ago at the alumni meeting, who banded together to create a place that really spoke to the needs and raised the voices of African American students, and there were demands made. We had a big protest that was held in the chapel that we needed a more diverse faculty and a more diverse student. I mean, so there was a lot that was going on during that time, and looking back on it, it was hard to explain to our parents because they sent us off to Wellesley thinking, well, that's a safe place to spend 4 years. And I think their mindset was closer to what Madeleine was describing. Yeah. And then, I would call home and tell my parents that I couldn't talk because I had to get to a protest. And they would, what are you protesting? You're at Wellesley College, go study, go to the library. And that was a very difficult time for parent-child relationships in our country, not just at Wellesley, because there were so many difficult conversations that were taking place. You had the civil rights movement, you had the women's movement starting, you had the kind of anti-war movement starting. I mean, there was so much going on, and our parents were the World War II vets. They were people who lived through the Depression, lived through the Second World War. They really just wanted a calm, normal, peaceful world for themselves and their kids. And then these kids they sent off are now protesting and asking all these difficult questions. So it was a challenging time.
Yeah. Well, what I can say is that, as I look at the progression, Wellesley's never been the same since 1969, which is a wonderful thing. And it's a wonderful thing. So, if you look back on your Wellesley years, what is the most distinct memory that you have?
Well, I was thrilled to be here in every way. I was a scholarship student and a refugee, and really just thrilled to be here. And I kind of thought about what were certain things that happened that had an effect on my life. First of all, I didn't realize, all of a sudden with bells happening, I was in Homestead, and there was a call, and they said, Maddie Corbell, there are some ladies here from Boston who want to take you in to show you what the American girl wears. So I came down in my Bermuda shorts and Shetland sweater. But so I was seen, I was quote, a foreign student. I was not an American citizen yet. So then in January, all of a sudden I go back to my room, and there are these huge posters put up by Emily Cohen and Susan Dubinsky saying, aliens must register. And so I was an alien, and so it made me really think about immigration laws. And I studied them when I was in political science class, and then I became a citizen between my sophomore and junior year, and I insisted, as I was being questioned at the Denver County Courthouse, to talk about the McCarran Act that I thought was unfair in terms of immigration. And so I'm lucky that I got my citizenship. And it really has had an effect on my life in every single way. One of my favorite things to do as Secretary of State was that on July 4th, 2000, I went down to give the naturalization certificates at Monticello. I figured since I had Thomas Jefferson's job, I could do that. And so I hand this man his naturalization certificate, and he says, you know, I heard him saying to some people, can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State. So then I went up to him, and can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And that is what I do. And by the way, since I actually got a little political before you did, so what happened, I was just on the train on Amtrak going from Washington to New York, and it was about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, when spring vacation was going on, and the conductor gets on, and he says, the train is going to be very, very full because it's spring vacation, and I'm asking those of you that are traveling alone to move together because we don't want to separate the parents from the children.
Wow. Wow.
Wow. Well, you know, actually, you were a refugee twice, as I recall. So you have very personal, relevant experience. I had never heard of Wellesley. I had never heard of Wellesley. I was going to a very large high school outside of Chicago, and my senior year, we had a government course, and it was taught that particular year by two young masters in teaching students. One had graduated from Wellesley, one had graduated from Smith, and they were at Northwestern in this program getting their masters in teaching, and their practical experience was teaching in our high school. And I really fell under their influence. I thought they were incredible. They were, you know, young and smart and really good in the classroom. And so one day, the one that I had asked me where I was going to go to college, and this was probably, I don't know, late September of 1964. I said, I don't know. I'm going to go to college, but I don't know where I'm going to go. And she said, well, could the other teacher and her talk to me about going to the schools they went to, Wellesley or Smith? I said, sure, I didn't know anything about it, so I sat down. They talked to me about why going to a women's college would be really a great experience, and how great it was to be at a college where you could study all week and then you could go out on the weekends. And that all sounded good. And then they brought me material, and they suggested that I go to some gatherings that alumni were having to meet other potential students and people who had gone to the colleges. So I started doing all of that. And, my mother had never gone to college, and my father had gone to Penn State on a football scholarship. So I knew that was not my path to higher education. So they were really, my father had saved up his money, and he said that I'd have to work wherever I went, but that they could, pay for 4 years of basically tuition, room, and board. So I started looking at places, and I heard about these other places. And so finally, long story, I talked to people, particularly those two teachers. I got materials from the colleges, and I fell in love with Wellesley because of the lake. I thought, wow, what a beautiful place to spend 4 years. I never visited, so I had no idea other than it had a lake, and that one of the two teachers I admired had gone there. So when it came time to show up in September, I was, anxious about seeing it. My father had made 2 rules. He said he would pay for it, but I could not go west of the Mississippi. I don't know why he came up with that, but that was his total red line. And I couldn't go to Radcliffe because they had beatniks. I mean, that was it. I mean, and I remember we drove from Chicago. My mother and father drove me, and somehow we ended up in Cambridge, and my father kept muttering, beatniks, beatniks, beatniks. And then we ended up at Wellesley, and it was just as beautiful as I had hoped it would be. So my parents, said goodbye, and I felt so lost. I mean, that my biggest memory is how out of place I felt. I mean, everybody I met just seemed to be so much more well-traveled, and they spoke foreign languages, and they just had a sophistication that I certainly did not feel. And so I was really, really anxious and feeling out of place. So about 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe into the first semester, I call home. And, you called home collect. For those who are from, younger classes, that was a thing where your parents had to pay for the call. That was basically how it worked. And sometimes they'd say no. And so anyway, I got them both on the line, and I told them, I said I wanted to come home. I really didn't feel like I belonged here. Everybody was really so much smarter and all of that. So my father, who didn't want me going away that far anyway, he said, well, come home, and you can get a job and then go back to some nearby school. And my mother said, absolutely not. You're staying there. You're not coming home. And I had to stay. So thankfully, it got a lot better. So I remember the beginning, and I remember the many, many times I walked around the lake. I remember a lot of the professors I had who were superb. But mostly I remember, the friends that we made and the people that became part of our lives together, and a lot of whom are here from that class now. And because it was such a tumultuous time and there was so much going on outside, it really added to the importance of the people that you spent most of your time with in the dining hall and in classrooms and in your rooms, and just basically trying to make sense of what was going on in the world.
Yeah. Well, it's just so interesting because both of you really had the experience of coming to Wellesley and feeling other. And it's such an important story, I think, to tell, because there are so many, 17% of our incoming class are first generation. And for them to understand this experience, but then how we actually really eventually embraced you, and where you come out the other side, and the work we need to do to make sure that we keep those experiences fresh so that we don't forget what it feels like to do that. And I think it's something that we really keep front and center. And the other thing I would just say, Hillary, is that for a younger generation, we might have to describe what a beatnik is.
Oh, Google it.
And I went to Radcliffe, but anyway. But, amongst the many achievements that both of you had, you've both been secretaries of state. And we are so proud that we have 2 of the 3 women who have held that position in our country. Madeleine, you were the first, and Hillary, you were a U.S. Senator, and then you nearly broke the highest, hardest glass ceiling, and there were 3. She did. That's right, you did. She did. And as you just said, Madeleine, and there were 3,000 of us here. And then you went on to become an amazing Secretary of State. For both of you, was this ever anything you would have anticipated when you left Wellesley?
No. Let me say, one of the things, what happened was I had a totally different plan. I was going to be a journalist. I had actually spent time as one of the editors of the Wellesley News. You were talking about John Kennedy. When he was Jack Kennedy and he was running for the Senate, he came by. I interviewed him. I was totally in love. And then I got his autograph. And I married the man that was a journalist also, and he said, "How unprofessional of you, Madeleine." Anyway, but I still have his autograph. And then my first vote was in Chicago, where it was counted many times, and so I was for him. But I was going to be a journalist, and I spent some time at a small newspaper in Missouri getting ready, and then we moved back to Chicago, and we were having dinner with Joe's managing editor, and he looks at me and he said, "So what are you going to do, honey?" I said, "I'm going to work on a newspaper," and he said, "I don't think so, because labor regulations don't allow that," and even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, he said, "And you wouldn't want to compete with your husband, so go do something else." And I saluted and did. I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a book, as I try to explain. Because I was a poli-sci major, what they did was every year they did a different set of articles to review, and so they were doing the geographical ones, and they figured that because I was a poli-sci major, I could do that. And then there were times that there were spaces at the bottom of newspapers and columns, and they needed to have some factoids. So I read EB, as we called it, and I still remember things like ostriches are voiceless, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. So then we moved to Long Island, and it's interesting because I was very fat, and it was before sonograms, and they kept saying, you're fat, stop eating." And I started taking Metrocal, which was some diet drink, and a lot of coffee. It just turned out I was having twins, and so they were born 6 weeks early, and so I then took advantage of that time because I had to leave them in the hospital to learn Russian. I never could take Russian here. Well, I had always wanted to learn Russian, but I didn't take it here because as a Czech, I understood it, but I didn't know the alphabet, so I couldn't take second-year Russian. So I took Russian for 8 hours a day for 8 weeks, and that made me want to go to graduate school. And I have to admit, I loved having children, but it was pretty boring. They had to eat every 3 hours. It took them each an hour to eat. And I watched a lot of TV, and I thought I didn't go to Wellesley to do this. And so I was able to combine my different lives, but very different from what I thought I was going to do. I loved foreign policy, there's no question. Wherever we went, I started an international relations club and made myself president of it. And all we ever did at my house was talk about foreign policy, but it never, ever occurred to me that I could have a job like that. I am totally, totally indebted to the Clintons in every single way. President Clinton first made me ambassador to the United Nations, which I loved, and that's how we really got to know each other, because as First Lady, Hillary would come up and visit me. There were a lot of people who made fun of the fact that she channeled Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt had been a great actor at the United Nations. You would come up, and we would do things together, and then we went to the Women's Conference in Beijing together, and I think we were a pretty good tag team on a lot of things. And I would not have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary, and the reason I know that is President Clinton said so. Yeah.
Publicly. Well, I have a very different story about how I ended up as Secretary of State. when I was here at Wellesley, I majored in political science, and I had a great course in international relations taught by Barbara Green. And it was really stimulating, and then Professor Evans taught a course about, which included simulation of international crises. And so there was a good component of foreign relations in the political science courses and the department when I was here. But I went to law school, and I came out of law school and went to work for the Children's Defense Fund because my real passion was kids and kids' lives and trying to represent them and advocate for them. And I was very fortunate to work for Marian Wright Edelman. And then when when I moved to Arkansas and I taught in the law school, and then married and taught, continued to teach, but also then practiced law, I just never thought about running for office or ending up being Secretary of State. So it took a series of events that led me to the first decision, which was to run for office, which came out of a lobbying campaign, really, by people in New York. And it started in the days after the midterm election in November of 1998, when I got a call after then Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan had said he wasn't going to run for re-election. So then Congressman Charles Rangel called me at the White House and said, a bunch of us want you to run. I said, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to run for the Senate. I'm not going to do that. And he goes, oh, come on, you've got to at least talk to us. And then there became a kind of steady stream of people coming to see me, and sometimes people who wanted me to run would say on TV that they thought I was getting closer to running, and I would get really upset, and I would call and I'd say, I'm not closer to running, I'm not running. And this went on, for months. And I didn't think that it was something that I would want to do. I thought, when the White House years ended, I would teach, I'd want to be involved in nonprofit work, and that's what was on my mind. So I've told this before, but it really was a pivotal moment. I was First Lady, I was in New York, I was at a high school in, believe it or not, Chelsea in New York, and I was part of publicizing an HBO special about women in sports. And Billie Jean King was there, and other well-known women athletes were there, and the name of the series, the program, was Dare to Compete. And of course, it was about athletic ability. And so I was introduced by this young woman who was captain of the basketball team and a lot taller than me. And she gave this very nice introduction. And then I went over to go to the podium. I put out my hand to shake her hand. She bends over and she whispers in my ear, "Dare to compete, Mrs. Clinton, dare to compete." And yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, it was one of those moments you just like, whoa, can hardly breathe. I thought, wow. I went to Wellesley. I have told countless numbers of young women and some not so young women to follow their dreams, to be competitive, to do what they believed in, to make the choices that were right for them. And now this young woman is basically challenging me. I was the First Lady of the United States. So I really thought hard about that, and it truly changed my perspective. I mean, years later, I saw her, her name was Sophia, and I said, you are responsible for all of this. But I decided to run, and I was very fortunate to get elected to the Senate in 2000, to get reelected in 2006, then to run in a hard-fought campaign for the Democratic nomination in 2008, and it was very hard-fought, as we all remember, and it was neck and neck, and it was decided by a very few number of votes and delegates. And once it was over, I had a lot of respect for my opponent, then Senator Obama, so I endorsed him, literally within a couple of days, and did my first event with him, and then did like 100 events for him. So I was thrilled when he won. I thought it was, absolutely the right thing for the country. I spoke in his favor at the convention. I persuaded a lot of my supporters not to put my name into nomination. So I did all of that. And he won. Okay. So I thought, okay, I'm going back to the Senate, and, I'll be whatever help I can be to get his agenda through. So Bill and I are taking a walk in a really beautiful nature preserve near where we live in New York, and half the time we cannot get a cell phone signal where we live. We are in the middle of a forest preserve, and Bill's phone rings. And we were both so startled we had no idea what it was. So he answers it, and it's the president-elect. And so President-elect Obama says he wants to talk to Bill, and then he wants to talk to me. And Bill says, well, we're in the middle of this forest, and we'll call you back when we get home. So, of course, we go home, we call back. And so the president-elect had questions to ask Bill about, potential cabinet members, White House people. And then he says to me, I want to see you. Can you come to Chicago this week? I said, sure, yeah, why not? Sure, I'll come to Chicago. So I had no idea. I thought it was a very gracious gesture. I thought that he wanted to talk to me about his legislative agenda. So I get to Chicago. And, we exchange pleasantries and all of that. And then he says, I want you to be Secretary of State. I said, no, that's not a good idea. I said, there are so many other people with more experience. And I gave him a list of about, 5 people that he could consider. And he goes, no. He said, I've really thought a lot about it. He said, the country's in a mess. I have to deal with the leftover economic crisis. We got problems around the world. So I can't do both. So you got to, help me out here. I said, Mr. President-elect, I am very, very honored, but I cannot do this. I want to go back to the Senate. So he says, well, I'm not taking no for an answer, and I want you to think about it. I said, all right, so I have to be polite and think about it. So I go home and I think about it, and I talk to my husband about it. I talked to a few other people about it, and I have absolutely resolved that it's not the right thing for me. And I think there are other people, and I think I can be very helpful to him in the Senate. So I call him back, 48 hours later, and I said, I've really thought about it, and I just don't think it's the right decision for you or for me. And so he says, I don't want to hear from you again until you tell me yes. Now, I got to tell you, my husband asked me to marry him twice, and I said no. So I have this pattern with and so, yeah, I eventually got to yes, actually in both cases. So, yes, I did, I called him back. And here's what really changed my mind. I thought, if I had won and I had wanted him to be in my cabinet, I would have wanted him to say yes to serving our country. And once I began to really think about that and what I would have hoped for, I knew I would have to do it. So it was an incredible experience. It was an amazing opportunity to represent our country. Madeleine always, talks about how when you land in another country and you're in a plane that says the United States of America, it really does instill in you a sense of both, incredible honor, but also responsibility. And I think that was what was the most amazing part of the job.
So I have to add something to that. During this decision-making process, you called me. And I was in a car. I pulled over, and you said that the president had asked you about this. What did I think? Was it a good job? And I said, loved it, you'll love it. And then I actually said, Hillary, it's better than being president because you don't have to worry about health care. And you said, I love health care.
I've been a glutton for punishment for a long time.
But the fun thing is, my granddaughter, when she was 7, 8 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State,
And
in another very, very small world example, Condi Rice was the student of Madeleine's father.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's all
It's a small
connected.
world. Absolutely. Wonderful. And, I just think it's so important that as women, we also understand that, our lives have various rhythms, and that for our students especially, sometimes they feel that they have to have it all planned out. And it doesn't happen that way, right? And more to come. But, you mentioned, Madeleine, you mentioned the UN Fourth World Conference for Women. And both of you were there. It is now, next year is the big anniversary. 25 years, Hillary, since you said human rights are women's rights are human rights. And Madeleine, I know you left your daughter's wedding reception, a little early in order to be there. And the both of you, it was a very powerful moment. Can you talk a little bit about what that moment was like, what has transpired, and what is the unfinished business?
Well, I have to say, I'm often asked about life balance. How do you... First of all, I do think that there are a lot of advantages to being a woman, many of which, because of biology, our life is broken up in a number of different ways, and you don't have to make a full plan for everything, and you have to follow your dream and stars and all those different things. So, but the issue was I did have to leave my youngest daughter's wedding reception to get on the plane and be with you. And it was the most remarkable thing, I have to tell you, because it was a huge conference in so many ways, and people listened or didn't listen. And then what happened was Hillary went up to the podium, and the place just went silent at first for the women's rights or human rights, and then massive applause, and it has begun. It began a whole thing where this was a slogan for people, and every country signed a contract to kind of follow through on things, and I think it was unbelievable, and it has made a mark. And by the way, we think, as we look at the Albright Institute, that one of the things, because of this anniversary, that we always pick a subject to look at, and we're going to do this in order to really understand what the effect is. Everybody did work on it, but I think it's far from finished. And I think that part of the issue is how easy it is to push back. All we have to look at is what's going on now. And in terms of changing a lot of states' laws and a number of different issues, and that's in the United States, and it's not true. In other countries, there also are issues. So it is unfinished business. And I think we need to stay with it. And we also have to recognize that women do have to work harder. There is just no question. And I've said this, and I apologize to the men in this audience, but there's plenty of room in the world for mediocre men. There is no room for mediocre women, and we have to work twice as hard.
Well, that conference really was, in many ways, a turning point. We didn't know that before it was held. There'd been previous United Nations conferences on women that had issued statements, made recommendations, but in 1995, when the Beijing conference was held, I think it's fair to say that a significant portion of the women in the world were uneducated, poorly fed, provided inadequate health care, often subjected to the most oppressive forms of subordination, denied rights by their governments, under the control of the men in their family, first their father, brothers, uncles, husbands. And so there was this pent-up interest in trying to figure out how could we frame this issue. And I had done some traveling in the previous year and a half where I had seen firsthand some of the obstacles that confronted women in being able to get an education and be able to access family planning for their families, being able to get health care. So I was very interested in going. Madeleine was at the UN and was one of the chairs of our delegation going to Beijing. And it was really controversial as to whether I would go. There were a lot of members of the Congress who did not want any American going to China because they thought it would be interpreted as some kind of condemnation of Chinese policy. There were people within our administration who were equally opposed to me going. They were fine if a delegation went and frankly, if not too much happened. And I was determined to go. And the State Department wasn't enthusiastic about me going. The National Security Council wasn't enthusiastic about me going. So I finally said to the folks who were unenthusiastic, look, I'm going to go. I'll either go on my own and fly commercially and get there, or I can go with the delegation. And my only ally was my husband. So that kind of decided it. And I was determined, since once I said I was going, I was given a speaking slot, that I would try to figure out a way to frame the issue so that it could be a rallying cry. And we started working on this speech. It went through absolutely innumerable drafts. We were finishing it on the plane on the way over. Madeleine was with us, and I'd be marking it up. We'd get new ideas, and on it went. So when it came time to deliver it, there's always a lag when you're having multiple translations going on. So you're speaking, and nobody is doing anything. And then all of a sudden they go, oh, they kind of get it. And there's a critical mass that responds. And so I thought, okay, we're kind of making progress here because I've laid out this argument. There's a lot more to the speech than, obviously just the, women's rights or human rights section. I criticized China for some of its policies, the one-child policy, forced abortion policy, coercive family planning policy, some of the other policies toward women, and so they cut off the feed of my speech throughout the big convention center. We didn't know that at the time, but yes, that happened. And so at the end of it, we got a good response, and it was very gratifying. And it was a jumping off point for a lot of people for two more things that happened. One is that there was a non-governmental organization gathering 45 minutes outside of Beijing. All these women from all over the world had come there. They weren't part of official delegations, and they wanted a place to meet, and the Chinese government put them 45 minutes out. So when I finished the speech, I was asked if I would go out and speak to the NGO group, and I said I would. So we went out there, and it was pouring rain. There was mud up to your ankles, and the security forces were really roughing people up. I don't know if you know Donna Shalala, who's now in Congress. She was, at that time, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and she's a quite short woman, right? And they were knocking her around, but do not knock Donna Shalala around. I mean, I was getting so worried because, Donna and everybody else, they're pushing their way through the Chinese security guards who were yelling at them. It was really tense. So I spoke there. And then the other thing was we actually were working on what came to be known as the Platform for Action, which was an actual platform for recommendations about every issue you could imagine. And for years after that was adopted, and it was a hard fight to adopt it, I would be in places and governments and NGOs and organizations of women would say, we followed that Platform for Action. We changed our inheritance rules. We changed our domestic violence rules. And it really did spark a movement for change in a lot of places. So it wasn't just the speech. The speech was part of the larger agenda that we were working on, but it really became a turning point. Now, fast forward, as Madeleine says, we've got a 25-year anniversary coming up, and we do need to take stock. I was part of an effort to take stock on the 20th anniversary in 2015, and we have made progress. We've made progress getting girls into school. Not so much progress keeping them in school, but getting them at least primary education. We've made progress on health care, but actually, not enough. We've made progress on trying to prevent child brides, trying to open up inheritance and other economic opportunities to women. So we've made progress. But I think it's also fair to say that there's always a struggle, and it's by no means a secure progress. So one of the things that it would be great for Wellesley to look at, and what Madeleine was saying about the program that has her name on it, is to take stock of where it is for women, and to pay attention to what's going on in our own country and some of the new legislation and regulations governing women's reproductive health, and making it clear that there have to be certain benchmarks that women are able to achieve that give us the autonomy to make decisions that affect the most important parts of our lives. And it's not just in health, it's in education, it's in the economy and everything else. So it laid down a good marker, but nobody can rest easy because it's under a constant threat of reversal, not only around the world, but even here in the United States.
So absolutely. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to take the prerogative here. We started a little bit late, so I'm just going to go a little bit late. And, just to this fact, the fact that we make forward momentum, we've been taking some steps backwards, very, very distressing. And we are living in this enormously polarized time. On campus, we are focused on how we get our students to talk across difference, but that is only a mirror, quite frankly, of the tremendous polarization in our country, which I do think is hurting us in so many ways and really turning the clock back. How do we move beyond this? How do we function and build bridges and figure out how we move forward in this tremendously polarized time?
Well, I just wrote a book. It has this bland title, Fascism, A Warning. I decided that I needed to put it into a historic context and to try to figure out what happens when societies are polarized. Because there are divisions in all societies, and there have been for some time. And I think recently much more has happened as a result of technology and job displacement, a number of different issues. And so what is interesting, if you look at things historically, Mussolini was the first fascist, and Italy had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I, but had not been recognized properly. There really were a lot of divisions in Italy in terms of their government and rich, poor, et cetera. And what happened is this man arises who is an outsider and somebody that knows how to speak well to people, and decides, rather than bringing the society together, began to exacerbate more in the differences. And so what is interesting, and this is something that I learned in terms of doing the book, because then I wrote about Hitler, and then what's happening now, is that they came to power constitutionally. Mussolini was given power by King Emmanuel, and Hitler was given power by von Hindenburg. The best quote in the book is from Mussolini, which says that if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So I think there's a lot of feather plucking going on now. And by the way, you can't say those two words quickly together. So
I love it.
And it is very hard to define fascist, because fascism is not an ideology. It is a process for gaining power. And because there are divisions, what is needed is a leader who can find common answers and find ways to solve the problems, rather than somebody that exacerbates the divisions. And so that exacerbation of really those divisions, and then finding a leader who identifies himself with one group at the expense of another, and then the other group becomes the scapegoats. So they are responsible for the divisions. Then people who think they're above the law and also think that the press is the enemy of the people. So what I now have my kind of, we all know the see something, say something. I have the do something list, and it is to call it out, then also to have people run for office, or those of us that aren't, support them. Then, and this is the difficult part, is to talk to people with whom we disagree. I happen not to like the word tolerance because that's put up with. I think we need to respect where their views are coming from and try to figure out how to talk to them, and it's not easy. And then ultimately, I said this the other night, is that there isn't a book or a speech written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So the quote that I like is, "The older I am, the younger are my teachers." And therefore, I do think we need to spend time talking to the younger generation, bring them into this, and really, so I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so that's why I decided to put out the warning.
I love it. I love it.
Well, amen to all of that. And be sure to pick up Madeleine's book, which really is quite remarkable in its very clear explanation. And I don't want to be a downer, but I will say this. If you take the time to read the Mueller report, actually read it, which all of us in this auditorium are more than capable of doing, you come to two inescapable conclusions. The first is that Russia conducted a sweeping and systemic interference in our election. The second is that obstruction of justice occurred. Now, you cannot read the report chapter and verse, fact after fact, without reaching those conclusions. And yet we are living at a time when there is so much distraction and competition for our attention that what would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, is now just yesterday's news. I have the rather unusual experience of having worked on the 1974 impeachment inquiry staff. Because when I was in law school, I was part of something called Barristers Union, which was the trial practice group at Yale. And 5 of us were asked to join the impeachment inquiry staff, which I agreed to. And it was an incredible professional experience and a very sobering public experience. And so my job, my first job on that staff, was to research and help write a memo about what is an impeachable offense. Literally, you cannot make my life up. So here we are. And there is no doubt, in my opinion, that what the founders were most worried about was anything that undermined the integrity of the government, that abused the power of the executive vis-a-vis the other branches of government, that really went to the heart of how you keep this delicate balance of a democracy going. So when I read a book like Madeleine's and you want to just jump up and yell at points like, why didn't more people speak out? You know, where were the leaders? Where were the business leaders and the academic leaders and the press leaders? And for a million different reasons, in a lot of these settings, people were either not paying attention or they had the unfortunately foolish idea that a Mussolini or a Hitler could be controlled. And so the demagoguery, the appeal to the crowd, the very clever use of symbols, the intimidation, verbal and physical intimidation, was overlooked. And this is a classic pattern. There is nothing new about it. It's just different means of messages being delivered. And I think given the rapidity with which information can be conveyed today because of the internet, it is an even more dangerous set of circumstances because it moves so quickly and it can get so overwhelming. And people, just want to quit hearing about it and get back to their normal lives. There is nothing normal about undermining the rule of law. There is nothing normal about attacking the press. There is nothing normal about trying to undermine another branch of government. There's nothing normal about trying to use the legal system to go after your political enemies. There is nothing normal about any of that. And so I think Madeleine's book is really well named, Fascism, a Warning. And the idea that, it can't happen here is just old-fashioned, my friends. So there is so much at stake and so much that people should be trying to sort through for themselves and perhaps joining in action together to speak out. So I am a very worried optimist because there seems to be no staying power for a lot of these really serious threats. And that's part of the strategy. You do something today that's even more outrageous than what you did yesterday. You say something that is totally beyond the pale of what should be expected from any public official. And so what happened yesterday is quickly lost in what's happening today. And this goes way beyond party. More than 1,000 former prosecutors appointed by Republicans and Democrats all said these incidents that are related in Mueller's the second half of his report clearly amount to indictable obstruction of justice charges. And there are so many Republicans who are speaking out, who are organized to keep trying to sound the alarm, but not enough of us. And that means regardless of party, I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, libertarian, green, vegetarian, it doesn't matter. Whatever you are, if you care about this incredible experiment that we've been engaged in now for 200 plus years, then you have to be concerned about this. We can get back to arguing about all kinds of things. I was in the Senate for 8 years. I worked with Republicans and I opposed Republicans. That's the way it is supposed to work. And there were Republicans then who are still there, who know better and are afraid to stand up and say what they know.
We promised the audience we'd do a couple of questions, and I think I have the answer to the first one, which is, what would you like to see more Wellesley alumni doing in the world today? I think you've answered the question. Can you tell us, another question is, what do you view as the greatest gifts that Wellesley has given you?
Well, I think two, frankly, friends. I think that we the friends that we made here make all the difference, and the capability of always calling on that friendship when it's good and when it's hard. And so I think definitely that. But then skills of trying to figure out how you work your way through problems, logic, and a voice to talk about what you've learned. And so I think those are the things, and then have the friends support the voice.
Perfect.
That's absolutely right. I agree with that completely, and I just want to answer the first question you asked, Paula, because not everybody's interested in politics who goes to Wellesley. Not everybody wants to be in an appointed or elective office. Absolutely. But people here are interested in something. And if you are interested in math and science and technology, use your skills to communicate the importance of facts and evidence and science as a way of understanding the world that we are in. And if you study the humanities and the arts, use that incredible education, the liberal arts education that is so paramount here, to try to find ways that you can link what you study or what you work on or care about with broader problems in the world, so that your skills and the substance that you've gained here at Wellesley can be put to work on a regular basis. And, Paul and I have talked over the last now nearly 3 years about, how challenging it can be for young people, because we are basically conducting a massive experiment in how you develop from a child to an adult. Because with technology, there are so many ways to disconnect from what we call IRL in real life and connect through a distance, connect through a screen. Not the relationships that are face-to-face, but that are carried over the airwaves. What is that going to mean? How do we even think about that? And a great educational institution like Wellesley can help us maybe understand that, and the people who come forth from here, particularly educated and ready to go forth and do what you believe is of interest and your passion and maybe make a difference in the world, we need your help in trying to figure this out. So this is an exciting time to be a young woman. It's a thrilling time. As with any time, there are all sorts of challenges and questions that you individually will have to answer and that as a group you have to confront. But if we think of Wellesley as a sort of a platform, think of it as a really high platform, and you're going to be up there studying and learning and getting to know people and trying to understand yourself better, who you are, where you came from, where you want to go. And then you graduate and you take that plunge. You are well equipped to take the plunge. It doesn't mean it won't be hard to navigate, because life has a way of surprising us, but you are so well equipped, better than 99.9% of the women who've ever lived in the history of the world. And so think about what means the world to you, and then figure out how you're going to make that world more like what you aspire to and what you dream of. And I think Wellesley set us all off on that path.
Thank you. Did you want to finish? I think we have our marching orders, and not only for our students and our youngest alumni, but given how our lives evolved, it is the work that we all should be engaged in. And I could sit here and talk with you for another hour, but I just thank you for really spending time with us and sharing reflections and wisdom. And before we end, I do have a small gift for each of you.
Paul,
Madeleine.
Can I just say, before we end, I am so grateful, as we all are, that you are president. Absolutely incredible.
Thank you. It is truly my great honor, Let me get this for you. These are bound copies of your senior honors theses. Oh, green. Which one is yellow? Oh, you're yellow, and you're green. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of reunion. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
President, I love that.